Hello again everyone, and welcome to your second C++ tutorial. Today I will be breaking apart the computer program which we did in the first tutorial. When we first created a project in CodeBlocks, it made a very simple computer program for us to test out, to ensure everything was running smoothly. So now when we build and run this, we can say hello world on the screen, and that is all this computer program does. It prints out hello world on the screen. Computer programs are made up of a few lines of text, and this is probably the simplest program you can write, but this itself already has 7 different lines in it. So you can see that even for the most basic program you need to write at least 7 lines of code. So this is probably the more complicated tutorial, but I will break it down and simplify it as much as possible for you. You need to know a number of things in order to run a simple program. But once you've learnt and understood the basics, then everything else will be very simple to follow. So we'll begin by a brief introduction to what each line does. So this include IOStream line is technically called a preprocessor directive. A preprocessor directive means that we will include a file in this program which we will use later. It needs to include the file IOStream so we can run this program later on. The next line is just a blank line. So this is similar to the lines and spaces in a book, for example. In programming, it just makes the program easier to read. You can add as many blank lines and spaces between your codes, or you can have none at all. So there's no hard and fast rule, it's whatever is easiest for you. And the same thing applies to tabs. Some people prefer to use tabs to line things up and make the program easier to read, and some don't. So you'll come to realize that blank lines, spaces and tabs are not really significant, they just make the program easier to read. So under the blank line is this using namespace std. std basically stands for the standard library. So this is another thing that is built into C++. We will be using all the standard things with C++. So basically these 2 lines include a file and something called a library, which we will need later on. Now let's focus on the heart of computer programming, and that is something called a function. So every computer program is comprised of functions. Functions are basically commands you give the computer, like play sound or draw graphics. All computer programs start with a function called main, and this is how your computer knows where to start. So anytime you run a program, your computer automatically knows that it has to start with the main function. This prevents it from getting confused when it is given lots of different commands. So how do we make it a function? You have to begin by writing the type of data you'll be working with. Functions tend to do some kind of calculation, like for body mass index or velocity, and when it does this, it wants an answer back in numbers. Main always works with integers, and that's why we need that, but this will come later on. Following this is the name of the function, and in this case, as you know, the name is main. Now let's talk about these curly braces or brackets. In between these open and closed curly braces, you have something called statements. You'll find that all functions are made up of statements, and all statements are basically instructions. So all instructions have to end with a semicolon. Each line, a series of instructions inside a function, always ends with a semicolon. So basically every function needs to include statements or instructions. So now let's break this down further. Here we have something called the output stream object. This is basically used to type characters on the computer screen. The output stream object is always used together with something called the stream insertion operator. This basically takes all the symbols and everything on its right hand side and prints it into legible characters like hello world on the screen. Finally, in this tutorial, I want to talk about the return statement. As I mentioned before, functions like to do calculations and usually want an answer back. So if I had a function that was calculating my BMI, it would return with a specific number. The main function would always have return 0. Whenever you return 0, it basically tells your program that it ran smoothly without any errors. So, for example, if you had any extra text, your program would give you an error and wouldn't move on to the next line, which means it would never return 0. So when it does get to this line, it means everything else before it, above it, was fine. So return 0 basically means all went well and main ran smoothly. As I said before, every computer program starts with lots of information that you need to know. And then as we move further along, we will have a more in-depth look at each topic. So right now, I just want you to have a basic understanding of how a computer program is made. So it doesn't matter if you don't understand it fully right now, it will become clearer in future tutorials.